Good afternoon. Thank you for being with me as I talk about stigma and the misconceptions of suicide. A little bit about myself. My name is Ace Bolger. I'm a person just like you. There's nothing really special about me. I don't have any special training. I am a dad who lost a daughter to suicide, and after we had a time to grieve, I didn't want her death to be in vain, and so I began to do some research and some connecting and networking to see if I could be a possible help to other people out there who had family members or loved ones who were struggling with depression or suicidal ideation or anxiety or mental difficulties of any kind. And I just feel very, very blessed to be able to present some information that may be of use to you. And there are thousands of you like me out there. And so hopefully I can be a voice for you, and also I'm an encouragement and a resource for other people who are currently struggling with a loved one or a family member who is in the throes of some sort of mental illness or anxiety or depression or what have you. So I really appreciate the time to be with you, and hopefully you'll be getting some information you can use today. Some of the key concepts that I think about, one, I will go over this a lot, is complexity. The whole issue of mental health, and specifically suicide, is an extraordinarily complex issue. I talk about that because one of the major concepts of today is stigma. And when we understand how complex this issue is, I begin to hope that that somewhat attacks the idea of stigma. We'll talk about what stigma is, but it's directly related to understanding the complexity of mental health. Another key concept is integration, whereas the different elements of a system are working together on a whole, and when they're doing so, that means that we have the best chance to be our very best people when we're working, all of our cylinders are working together to empower us to be the best we can be. Another concept is resilience. That would be the immediate goal when people are suffering from mental illness, suicidal ideation. Is like, how do we get them back into a point where they are resilient enough to be able to move forward with their lives? A concept you may have heard of, epigenetics, relatively new in the scientific world, maybe 20 years known. We'll talk a little bit about that and how that impacts our mental health. We'll talk a little bit about implicit and explicit memories, and that'll be just to reinforce again the complexity of this whole issue of mental health and illness. And we'll have some resources for you, some practical examples of resources and some practical strategies. So those are the things I hope to cover today to give you some value in your taking time to spend with me. Thank you. The other thing is on here, the transformative process, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. There are some things that you know now, some things that you have as values and beliefs that are worth holding on to. There are some things that are just flat wrong or destructive that we need to let go. There are some things we don't know yet that maybe we will learn that we can take on, and having done that, then we can move on, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to move on a little bit more clearly with some of the resources and understanding about mental illness and stigma. So some questions for reflection for you. And I came up with these trying to put myself in your shoes and thinking, why would I tune into a webinar on suicide and stigma? And so here's some things I thought, and you have your own perhaps, but what do you hope to take away from this presentation? And if someone says that they're suicidal and asks for help, what do we do? And how do we know who to approach about suicide and mental health? When someone is acting differently than we are used to, what do we do? Do we even bring up the idea of suicide? What do you look for? What symptoms or behaviors do you look for? And what caused the symptoms in the first place? Is then, as I think about it, suicide prevention a reactive policy, or might we say it's a responsive effort? Still, what are we responding to if that's the case? So I'm sure you have some reflective questions. I hope you write them down, and this might help you through those. So when we talk about prevention, again, what are we trying to prevent? And so we would say, well, what are the causes or reasons for suicide? Are there causes then that we're trying to prevent? If the causes are the predictable results of ACEs, and we'll talk about ACEs a little bit later on, those are adverse childhood experiences. If some of the causes are predictable, should our efforts then be directed at preventing ACEs or towards preventing suicide by treating and anticipating the effects of ACEs? And prevention might be proactive in the sense of anticipating mental health issues before symptoms are manifest. So when we talk about prevention, it's a huge question, really, and it has a whole lot of ramifications. And as I have studied prevention for the last 8 years since my daughter died, I've seen dozens of really good national programs. I now work with the Healthcare Authority and a state program, and there are many other state agencies that have wonderful programs addressing mental health and suicide prevention. There are resources galore available to us, and at the end of the presentation, we give you a little bit of those resources, and I would be more than happy to send more your way if you ask me. And then we're talking about the stigma and demystifying behavioral health. Stigma is something we will be talking about, but it really is a focus of many, many agencies and programs, is how do we destigmatize? What do we do to demystify behavioral health? It's a national focus. And then we have a proactive approach. Again, anticipating ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and the effects. The very well known to probably a lot of you out there is the fact that trauma is spoken about so much now, even in our social unrest, the trauma of the past and so on. How do we anticipate the affects of trauma, and how do we have a proactive approach to that? And then I'll be talking a little bit about epigenetics and genetics, which is a fascinating field in and of itself that probably most of us don't spend a whole lot of time reading through or studying, but it definitely has an impact on our individual biochemistry and our own mental health. And we'll talk a little bit about nutrition and individual biochemistry. And then one of the things that seems to be forgotten, which is so critical and so simple, is exercise, sunlight, and sleep, and how that is a powerful approach to helping solve mental illness and depression. And then we'll talk about networking, and we talk about cross-agency, we talk about individuals, and later on we'll give you a couple of examples of what networking actually looks like in terms of helping you help somebody else. And yeah, this is when my daughter first started showing symptoms of that we were alarmed by. At first we thought, well, is it just because she's an adolescent? She's just going through the normal changes. I was a middle school principal, so I worked with kids in change all the time. And so it was not real new to me and my own daughter. I thought, well, okay, is this just part of her middle school year change? But once we began to be suspicious that no, there's something going on here, our primary question is, now what do you do next? What do you do next to help them? And so here are some of the questions that some of you might have out there. You know, someone you love consistently shows signs and symptoms which cause you to wonder if something's wrong. What do you do? What do you want for yourself if you begin to experience suicidal ideation? And I don't know if many people have thought about that, but I'm pretty sure that people out there have thought about it. And what do you want for yourself when that happens? And then what might you want to be able to help somebody else who's suicidal? So these are pretty fundamental questions that are real and primary and important. And again, the goal, resilience. And the resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity and trauma and tragedy. And there are all kinds of reasons we might experience adversity, but the goal is to be able to overcome it and to become, again, integrated, whole, healthy. That's our goal. And that's what our goal would be, I think, in the preceding slide about what is it we would hope for ourselves and others. What do we do next? I was talking to somebody about this and they said, you know, I went through a situation with my father who took his own life, and that Mr. Bulger, that picture is exactly what I experienced. And I certainly did as I faced the difficulty of my daughter being suicidal for 7 years. It was like, what do we do? Where do you go? And that's exactly the kind of thing that we faced. And I'll share that a little bit more about this with you as we go along. But here's the ideal. This is the ideal. A system of care is a coordinated network of community-based services and supports that are organized to meet the challenges of children and youth with serious mental health needs and their families. I'm not going to go on and read the whole thing, but what it really does say is that it's a system that encompasses all professional and natural supports to help somebody else become resilient. And that's actually what we promote and are aspiring to achieve at the Healthcare Authority with the work we do with our clients and the citizens. So that's the goal. But next slide, please. This is what the reality is, and this is what I experienced with my daughter. And it came out of a book by The Family Guide to Mental Health Care by Lloyd Sitterer, who is the director of all the public health hospitals in New York City. And he says, in other words, you'll have to become something of a mini expert on everything, including what good treatment looks like, how to pay for care, the dizzying array and quality of private and public programs, and the laws governing mental health care, particularly patients' rights, medications, therapies, clinics, insurance coverage, mental health, and addiction laws. To the role of school and working recovery, and much more are about to become your subjects of study. And when I lost my daughter to suicide, Sitterer's words just rang true to me because that's what we experienced. And here's Alicia when she was about 3. This is the daughter that we lost to suicide about 18 years later. And part of what I bring this picture up is to show you is that, yeah, this is a real live person. This was anybody's child, very cute and happy and healthy. And I look at this and say, okay, where's the evidence here of mental illness? Next slide. So in addressing the need, in my opinion, Sitterer's previous comment should not be the reality a family faces when a loved one suffers from mental illness. And so for years, I have been hoping to change that existing reality by offering help at the individual, family, and community levels through coaching people through the complexities of receiving mental health care. And that's why I feel so totally fortunate to have been asked to be a part of Healthcare Authority, because I just was able to magnify my efforts through the support of a large agency and trying to address that need to attack the broken nature of our mental health system. And so this is addressing that need specifically, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And as we know, suicide is a very complex topic, or maybe we don't know that. Because typically after suicide, people want to know what caused a person to take their own life. Why would they do that? And a common assumption is that people just think, well, they're depressed. And it is accurate to say that depression and anxiety as mental health conditions can lead to suicide. But in addition to mental health, there are many possible conditions or circumstances which are risk factors for suicide. And this gets into the whole idea of complexity, which again is trying to help us address the idea of stigma. It's not just a simple issue or condition that causes somebody to take their life by suicide. And when we begin to realize that, then we begin to, I hope, attack stigma. So when we talk about complexity and risk meaning is somebody in danger of taking their own life. There are at least 3 broad categories, and that would be the health of an individual, the environmental factors, and then the historical, including genetics. We'll take a look at some of these things. So some of the health factors, mental health conditions. Yeah, we've talked about depression. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Anxiety, and bipolar, schizophrenia, borderline, conduct disorder, substance abuse disorders, serious chronic health conditions and or pain. I have a good friend who had a hip replaced about 10 years ago. The metal that they put in his hip deteriorated, it poisoned his body. And he told me that when he was in the midst of that experience, he was in such great pain, he literally wanted someone to come in and kill him. And if he had had the opportunity, he very well might have taken his own life. So these are just some of the different mental health conditions or substance abuse disorders or just chronic health conditions and pain that could cause somebody to be very serious about suicide. Next slide. And diseases, different types of diseases. I won't read through all of these, but it's not just taking any old disease and throwing it up there. The fact is that some of these diseases can be more causative, if you will, for people to lose hope, give up hope, become overwhelmed with pain, what have you, and consider suicide. Next slide. And then we'll talk about this more in the area of trauma as well, but risk factors, environmental, stressful life events, which might include a death, divorce, or job loss. And we're seeing with COVID right now that stressful life events are occurring, and we'll talk a little bit about what the prognosis is because of that, what relative to mental health and suicide. And prolonged stress factors, which might include harassment and bullying in relationships. I heard of a little boy who was in grade school who was ridiculed by his father for something that happened at school, and the little boy took his life. And it's almost unimaginable, but imagine how real it was to a little boy in that kind of a stress factor that he would take his own life. It's just staggering. And then, of course, the access to legal means, including firearms and drugs. The more available in a moment of vulnerability, the better chance you have of succeeding, if that's the right way to put it. Exposure to another person's suicide, we'll talk about that in terms of contagion, or the graphic or sensationalized accounts of suicide, and we'll talk in the next slide about contagion and copycat. And that's a process in which death by suicide of an individual influences an increase in suicides of other. Exposure via association, media reports, or both to another suicide can lead to somebody doing a copycat. When I was a principal at a large high school in Kirkland, we had 5 kids over a period of a year take their own lives, and there was no doubt that it was by contagion. Next slide. And then the risk factors historically, when you look at prior history of suicidal behaviors, what's going on with that person? Have they tried before? Have they have a history of trying to do themselves harm or take their own lives? What's the family history of suicide? What's the suicidal behavior from friends? And what's the history of the substance abuse? And what kinds of aggressive or antisocial personalities have they run into, or do they have? What is their isolation factor? So we'll take the next slide. But we do recognize that it is extraordinarily complex. We're just flying through these different possible causations for people to take their own lives, but hopefully even in the short presentation, we're going to begin to see that the whole idea of mental health and suicide is a very complex issue. If you click on that link, and I don't know if you can, but if so, I would just direct you to something that would be a resource for you down the road. I guess we can't go, just go back to that last slide, I'm sorry, for a second. When you click on that, you will come to a part of that where it says download, and I'm trying to think of the exact word for it, but it's a very, very nice website for ACEs, telling you what ACEs is, the adverse childhood experiences, and the costs of adverse childhood experiences in individual lives, the way it's manifest in behavior, possibly the rest of a person's life, unless they get some healing for the trauma that's related to ACEs. So I'm sad that we can't really go onto that link, but it is a great link for a resource for you. Next slide, please. Complexity and risk. Again, we're going to talk a little bit more about depression, and I will a couple more times. But at its core, on the cellular level, depression may be the result of chemical imbalances in the brain, and it can include dozens of substances. And when they're out of balance, notably neurotransmitters, major depression can be a result. And other causes are nutritional imbalances, hormonal imbalances, and on it goes in this slide. The reason I'm bringing this up is, again, to go into the weeds a little bit with depression as one area that we could focus on to reinforce the concept of complexity. Because when you look at it depressed, well, how come is somebody depressed? Well, if you look at this slide, there could be a lot of reasons why someone would be depressed, and each of them might require its own treatment. Next slide, please. Adding to the mix, biochemical classification of depression. I began to read areas that I had not really even thought about. After my daughter died, I was introduced to nutritional therapy from two doctors from Bastyr University in Kirkland, Washington. And they started talking about nutrition and biochemistry. And by the time I got through with their presentation, I was thinking to myself, holy cow, we are all so biochemically at risk. I'm surprised there's anybody healthy out there. But what it did, it started leading me to all kinds of different studies and books and authors, and ultimately even working in a healthcare authority. And so as I got into that, I'm going, all right, let's take a look at depression. And I find out that at least one study, Dr. Walsh, he's in the resources that I gave you into this presentation. He did 300,000 blood and urine samples over 2,800 people over 20 years, and had done an extensive, exhaustive study of the biochemical classification of depression, and says, you know, there's not just one type of depression which covers it all. There are at least 5 major biochemical classifications of depression. I won't go into all of these, but one of those is undermethylation, and we're going to talk about undermethylation because it is hugely important in terms of our synthesis of neurotransmitters, the natural way that the body can enhance the neurotransmitters. It is related to something called methylation. And the other things are in there. They're in the book that I refer to you, but the concept I'm trying to get for you on this is that there are a number of different biochemical classifications of depression. In fact, I want to read to you really quickly, just because I've got it here by his book. On page 90, the very end of it, of this one section, he says, this is Dr. Walsh, he says, despite brilliant advances in brain science, mainstream medicine continues to regard chemical depression as a single entity. And he goes on to talk about, gee, if that's not the case, if there are different types, then you know what, if we're using selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors for somebody who has undermethylation, that might be good, but if they have a folate deficiency, it could cause them to kill themselves. And you look at ads on TV and it says, take this drug, take that drug, and then it gives you about 5 times as long telling you the hazards of the drug. And I'm going, well, I wonder why that is. Well, as you begin to look at complexity, it's like, wow, if that's true, it's important to know, and that would be important to know for you helping yourself or somebody else down the road in terms of developing a network. Next slide, please. Now here's another one where we won't be able to go on to the link, but if you did, it takes you right directly to the part where it says, okay, the neurotransmitters of depression, and it's a great resource. It talks about the brain. It shows you the limbic system, the prefrontal cortex, the brainstem, all kinds of stuff. And I'm saying those words not because I'm a brain expert, I'm not, but I've learned a lot about the brain since my daughter died, and it helps me understand the complexity, and it helps me make sense of why I would want to link other professionals who do have expertise in this in an all-encompassing way to help somebody who might be fighting with mental health issues. So that's a great resource for you to learn more about the brain. And then just real simply here, the neurotransmitter cycle is that in the cells of the brain, we had the synthesis of the neurotransmitter, let's say serotonin, and then it gets released. It goes into the synapse between the presenting cell, the cell of origin, to the receptive cell, and it interacts with the adjacent cell. It's either excitatory or inhibitory. Serotonin would be an excitatory, GABA would be an inhibitory. And then when it's done doing its thing at that synapse, it is reuptaken. It goes back to the original cell to be reprocessed, to be used again. That's the neurotransmitter cycle. We'll talk about that a little bit more and why that's important in terms of combating mental health, both with nutrition and also pharmaceuticals. Speaking of pharmaceuticals, I don't have a picture here. I probably would like to include it, but I don't think it's morbid, but I did keep the bag full of pharmaceutical drugs that my daughter took over 7 years. And this slide indicates that in 1988, $500 million were put into pharmaceutical production. And then by 2008, it was up to $40 billion. Now, one of the things that my daughter would say to me is we went to several different psychiatrists. She was in several different hospitals. She tried several different types of drugs, combinations of drugs and so forth. What really struck me as a dad who's supposed to be able to fix things, when your daughter looks at you and says, "Daddy, this isn't working." Wow. And after she died and I started studying some stuff, I've got, one of the solutions is that we suppress the symptoms. We poison our own genes to try to deal with the symptoms and not really deal with the issues. Next slide. And this was Alicia just before she took her life. Again, there were two Alicias. We would go out and she was vibrant and happy and full and served people and had gone on foreign missions and was active and had plans and vision. And then the other part of her was dark and deep and disturbed. And this is the same girl who called me daddy and said, "Daddy, this isn't working." That is the pharmaceuticals. Now, what I do want to say is pharmaceuticals are not evil, bad, or not worth anything. What I do also want to say is they're not the sole solution to the problem of mental health. And on top of it all this stuff's going on. Somebody might have a history. Somebody might be sick. They have a disease. They have a mental health issue. That is enough to stagger anybody. But on top of it, we do have that thing called stigma. And it's a powerful social force which can result in many people struggling with mental health, not getting the help they need for fear they'll be discriminated against. And that's part of what we're trying to do here is address this and saying that if it's so complicated and so difficult and pervasive, then let's get rid of stigma. Instead of making it the person's problem, let's say that it's a part of the human condition and eliminate stigma. Next slide, please. What is stigma? You can answer this to yourself, I think. And who's susceptible to suicide? Who's susceptible to depression and anxiety? How would you define mental health? What about mental illness? What do you think is a public perception of depression, suicide, and mental illness? What do you think? Are there misconceptions about suicide or not? And before I think you probably know what I think, and then I go, yeah, we're all messed up on this. We don't have a really clue on it. We are stigmatizing people. I had a really good friend whose son was a very, very accomplished athlete who was at a collegiate level football player and was struggling with depression and a serious depression. And his parents basically said, it's buck up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. What's the heck the matter with you? That's ridiculous. That's a weakness. And that's stigma. That's stigma. And that's by, honestly, a loving parent. So who's susceptible to suicide? All of us are. It's a part of the human condition. That is, we are all susceptible sometime or another, could be, to situations, mental health issues, physical health issues. rather than be surprised and shocked by it and be ashamed by it, it's a matter of, okay, how do we address it if this happens to us, knowing that it is something that is not the individual's fault. Next slide, please. I won't read through all of this, but as I think about integration, where you take the different elements of a system and make them work as a whole, I think stigma is disintegration, because if we need the help of an entire community, professionals, and our natural support systems, then stigma would keep people from going to get that help, which would, to me, be the exact opposite of putting together a system. It would be disintegrating, and it would be such a tragedy because it's a mark of disgrace or reproach to think that if I become depressed and even suicidal, that it is my individual weakness. And as a matter of fact, you may have heard this statistic before, that depression might happen in as many as 60% of the people who take their own lives with suicide. But of that 60% of the people who take their own lives by suicide because of depression, less than half ever see anybody for help about it. Wow. And if that's because of stigma, what an absolute tragedy. Next slide. So one of the things that one of my colleagues and I at Healthcare Authority talked about and worked on for quite a while would be safe messaging. When somebody does die by suicide, how does the media respond to that? What is the outcome? What's the impact of that? And without it being very, very well designed in terms of heading toward hope and help and resilience, if it is just more sensationalized by who, what, when, where, how, what were they doing? They were suffering from family divorce or, family problems or financial problems. That's really not safe messaging. That's just sensationalizing it and really not addressing the human condition. And it can actually be very destructive, and it can lead to those things like we call contagion. So being how we talk about suicide once it's happened is really, really critical. And it's not something that just automatically we as a society have learned how to do. It needs ongoing training and sensitivity about how do you actually talk about suicide, especially once it's happened. Next slide, please. And these are some examples of what we would say to do with media reporting of safe messaging. You can look at these on your own, but they are significant in addressing stigma. Next slide, please. Mitigating fear. So now we know that there's stigma. We know that there are people who might be suffering from mental illness or suicidal ideation. And so here you are, if you're like me, just an ordinary person walking around the face of the earth, and all of a sudden somebody comes up and you're thinking, oh my gosh, they could be suicidal. What do I do? Well, fear could cause us to do nothing. So I would say that really, just being responsive and being aware and even wanting to help is mitigating the fear. I'm going to take it on, and every door is the right door. So don't let fear of us maybe asking the wrong question or talking to someone about suicide keep us from doing it. You could be the difference in their life. Next slide, please. So some practical strategies I talk about with this is just to say, when it's like there is no wrong door, these are different programs out there that exist in the world right now today. One of those out of Living Works Canada is called Safe Talk. I happen to be trained as a presenter in Safe Talk and have done that several times. Another program is called Learn. It's out of Forefront out of the University of Washington, a fabulous program. I think that one of the webinars about this series of suicide was even about that program that was presented by Forefront. Another one that is a state level program is called WISE, Wraparound with Intensive Services. The concept is that you develop a network of professionals and natural supports around a person, and they're already out there. I'll just touch upon them a little bit to let you know that there are some practical strategies for us to deal with people who have suicidal ideation. Next slide, please. The Safe Talk. Suicide awareness for everybody. You actually go through the process and the training of telling the people about what you see in them, asking them questions about what they're saying and what you're seeing, listening to who they are, where they are in their life, and keeping them safe. This is really the tip of an iceberg. It's a 3-hour presentation about Safe Talk, but the whole idea is that you tell, ask, listen, and keep someone safe. And yeah, there isn't specific training in it, but I'll tell you what the end result of that training is. If you can do this at the end of the training, you're successful. And these are little tools you do just to build up the courage to be able to talk to somebody about it. Next slide. Because typically in Safe Talk, there are 3 reasons people don't ask somebody about suicide, and that's because they miss the symptoms. They just don't even see them. Or they see them and go, I'm just going to dismiss it. I'm not going there. Or they just avoid it. It's like, that's not my problem. And so those are really kind of fear issues, or maybe even you could be feeling that you're too busy to talk to somebody. But in essence, it's really fear-based. And so the next slide, I guess I didn't have it in there. And the next slide is that, I'm sorry on this. The bottom line to the Safe Talk is to say something like this to somebody who you have watched, listened to, asked, and heard, and said, are you thinking of killing yourself? You know, and we've actually practiced that. And that can make the difference. But a lot of people either miss, dismiss, or avoid and won't do that. We're saying, yeah, you can. The other program that we just talked about is Learn through the University of Washington Forefront. And again, it's similar to the Safe Talk. You look for warning signs, you listen, you empathize, you ask directly about suicide, just exactly what I was just saying. You make sure that there are no immediate dangers, and you try to get them to the next level of care and seek resources to help them. Those are immediate frontline first aid type of interactions with people that are really critically important, that are out there and available, and you could probably do it on your own without having to go through training. But the fact is that there is no wrong door. Next slide, please. So, anatomy of an epidemic. 1 in 5 will experience a psychological issue, and 74% of those before the age of 25, by an author named Robert Whitaker. And this is something that's somewhat staggering to me. 1 million suicides a year worldwide, which is more than all the military battles of the world in a given year. Now, I talked earlier on about risks. I talked about environmental factors, about trauma. And so here's the question: shall we expect an increased risk of suicide between October and December of 2020? And the answer is, according to some of the reports of the Department of Health, that because of the nature of pandemics and previous studies, and the prognosis of things, in kind of a staggering way, it's like, yeah, we can expect a very significant rise in mental health, suicidal ideation, and in suicide attempts in October, November, December. Let's see, this is October, right now. And it's like an epidemic. And the next slide, for me, is like that gorgeous mountain, Mount Rainier. We're looking at a mountain of issues that are related to COVID for sure, but just in general, mental health is an issue that is so important, and it's not just going to go away. We're not just going to become healthy just because we want to. It's going to take some work. Next slide, please. Yeah, a bombshell in life. It's difficult to keep someone alive. I know, because I tried it for 7 years, and it is extremely taxing emotionally, financially, impacts every quality of your life, demands your time, exhaustive, challenging, lonely, frightening. It is extraordinarily difficult. And I would say that my wife and I wasn't married, but we were very close to our children, and my ex-wife and I were very, very involved with Alicia throughout the whole time. In fact, probably because of that, she had every best chance with what we did know at the time of surviving, but it was devastating to us in a number of ways. So next slide. So we're after, in the midst of that devastation of someone, it doesn't even have to be that they take their life. It could just be they try to take their life, or that they are saying they want to take their life. It is a staggering, shocking event to have that happen. And so what you're really hoping for is hope and health and resilience and recovery. And so we're going, yeah, that is possible. Next slide. And here's something that to me is a bit of an irony, and that is resilience in the midst of COVID-19. Here's what we're told, and here's what people are told. Here's what the general population is told is, okay, focus on developing social connections, big or small, reorient and develop a sense of purpose, become active and psychologically flexible, and focus on hope. And I'm going, all right, that's all good, wonderful, and there are ways we can try to do that. However, if you think about it, we're in the midst of social isolation right now in order to combat COVID. So I'm thinking, well, how do those two fit together? How do we really interact with that reality, those mandates, and the projection that we're going to have an increase in mental illness and suicidal ideation? I mean, I don't know about you, but this is a staggering problem to me. And so maybe this webinar will give you a little bit of tools and resilience and hope in terms of how you can actually interact with these concepts, realities right now as we're moving forward. Next slide, please. Now, this is something that we do at the Healthcare Authority as a really specific program for a population who is Medicaid eligible only. I don't bring it up because I think necessarily that a lot of people would go, hey, I think I'll try to get into WISE, although if you did qualify, that would be a wonderful program. But there's a bigger concept behind it. And it's what WISE really is, as a sustainable service delivery system of care providing intensive behavioral health in home and community settings to Medicaid eligible children and youth based on their individual needs. And it's a team approach. And the team members include natural supports, family, friends, religious leaders, and the professionals who work with you and your family. Now, I bring this up because I tried to do that with my daughter when she was struggling. I went to just about every doctor and every counselor that she had and established a relationship with them with her blessing. And after she died, I went around to some of those providers and said, gee, would you be interested in the concept of having a network where the doctors talk to each other, where the psychiatrists talk to each other, where the family talk to each other, the counselor talk to each other around this child? It was staggeringly resisted. I don't have time for it. My clients who are highly motivated do that on their own. And I'm going, well, my daughter was pretty highly motivated and she couldn't do that on her own. And what do you have to do when a person isn't highly motivated, but they need that wraparound support? So the point of this isn't so much about the healthcare authority wraparound with intensive services. The idea is to develop a team approach because, believe it or not, it is staggeringly difficult to try to keep somebody well who's mentally ill, who is trying to kill themselves. It is way beyond you. At least it was me, and I gave it my very, very best shot. And I tried to do some of these things, but I see the incredible value of a team approach in helping anybody in any circumstance, especially in mental health. Next slide, please. Now we'll talk a little bit about epigenetics. And that's something about, it's an alteration in gene expression. Now, gene expression means, okay, you've got your neurons and they're going to express a gene. They're going to duplicate the gene. The DNA goes through RNA and a new cell is created. And alterations in gene expression that do not involve changes in the DNA sequence is something called epigenetics, or epigenetics on top of genetics. And what causes that, or what is that? It's not just something that just happened recently. It's something we only just recently discovered. That's the way the body works. And in the womb, certain chemical environments can cause which genes are expressed. And environmental factors can alter genetic expression throughout life. And Many mental disorders result from environmental factors that cause genes to express improperly. Like what? Well, nutrient imbalances or toxic exposures. The key concept of epigenetics is that our DNA is not fixed, it's malleable, it changes based on factors that are both environmental and perhaps from the womb. And so that's pretty significant in terms of how we actually address mental health issues that are occurring right now. Next slide, please. So when we talk about epigenetics and mental health, and I talked earlier about DNA and also methylation, these are some fascinating things that as I continue to study through the brain and neurotransmitters and nutrition and so on, the DNA that we have in each of our cells is wrapped around something called a histone. These little tiny balls called histones. And the DNA wraps around that. The tighter the DNA wraps around the histone, the less it is going to express certain genes. So when you have methylation, it can then tighten the DNA around the histone, or if you have less methylation, it can loosen the DNA around the histone and the gene can be expressed. So who cares about all that stuff? Well, the issue between this, about this, is that one of those things that is expressed are neurotransmitters. And one of those things that is expressed are those things which take neurotransmitters back up into the original synapse or cell that created the neurotransmitter. Well, that was figured out about the mid 70s and 80s, and so we started having pharmaceuticals create these things called select serotonin reuptake inhibitors to actually inhibit the transporter drugs from taking the neurotransmitter back up into its original cell of origin. And so, okay, what that did was say, like, let's say serotonin in the brain. Well, serotonin is a mood enhancer in many cases, and so it's like, let's keep that serotonin in that synapse as long as possible. We'll use this select serotonin reuptake inhibitor to do so. It works, except that it has all kinds of side effects possibly, and as I mentioned earlier on, what if your biochemical type of depression has an absolutely adverse response to select serotonin reuptake inhibitors, in fact, increases your suicidal ideation? Wow. So epigenetics, mental health, and understanding this stuff, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a brain scientist, but I sure as the heck want to be able to take my daughter or anybody else to a system of professionals who understand this stuff and say, you know what, let's take the time to look at the individual biochemistry of this person before we start prescribing drugs or nutrients or anything else. Let's understand there's some complexity here, not just one pill fits all. Next slide, please. I just so happened to be on this wonderful webinar a while back by Dr. Hillary Kuhn at the University of Utah. And she was talking about genetics and mental health. And by golly, I'm going, man, I tell you what, this is so cool. There's all kinds of stuff, 22andMe or whatever it is on you hear on TV all the time, where take a look at your genetics and see if you have a predisposition for breast cancer or this kind of disease or whatever else. And it's all very exciting and it's very real. But you're going, all right, how much do we know about genetics? And how much can we use genetics right now to determine or evaluate or do a prognosis on what might be happening in terms of mental illness? So she was on this wonderful webinar and she said, you know, if you read on here, unfortunately, we're as yet pretty far away from relatable findings. I won't read through this whole thing with you, but the reason I bring this up is because genetics, epigenetics, is an exciting field of science where we can really begin to get even more precise about your and my individual biochemistry and how we can treat it. But there is no magic answer even right now in the study of genetics or epigenetics. It's extraordinarily complex stuff. but it's definitely worth pursuing. So next slide, please. And here's what she said to me when I asked her about it. You mentioned epigenetics, which I think holds amazing promise and is a true intersection between underlying genetic vulnerability and stress response. We are starting some studies in this area and are collaborating with some national researchers. We hope this will unlock additional results. Fantastic, it's full of promise. I love it. It tells us about methylation, acetylation, the production of neurotransmitters. It's outstanding. It is real and it can work on individual cases, but we're just at the tip of the iceberg of understanding it. Next slide. So I say, is it a definitive answer? Not yet. Not yet. So pharmaceuticals isn't the definitive answer. Nutritional supplements isn't the definitive answer. Getting rid of cancer isn't the definitive answer. It's a very complex issue, but I say that because it is worth knowing about. It is real. It can impact your life, but to think that, okay, there's any one solution to the problem of mental illness and suicidal ideation would be disingenuous. Next slide, please. Something else you've probably heard about, and it's been in the news a lot lately, is the transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. In other words, that which happened generations ago can impact you today. And that is true. Certain epigenetic errors can be transmitted to future generations without changing the DNA sequence. So harmful effects of toxic exposure can be passed on to one's children and grandchildren, and it can cause abnormal brain development. The thing that struck me about this was how really scary it is to think about children in the womb who are exposed to toxic things, fetal alcohol syndrome, other toxicity, metal poisoning of different types. It has not only impact on that person, but it can be passed on for generations. So it's just really pretty good to know that, yeah, a number of potentially devastating neurological consequences occur if any part of this carefully orchestrated development sequence is disrupted, meaning particularly in the womb. There's a really critical window of time there where we really need to be aware of our health and the health of our fetus. Next slide. Now I switch over here to implicit memory. I'm going from epigenetics to genetics to implicit memory, and the reason is on that because implicit memory is, by golly, related to trauma. And the last slide, which was talking about the transmission of epigenetic through generations. Well, here's an example in implicit memory. The thing about implicit memory is that we aren't aware of it. Implicit memory is the kind of thing that we use when we learned how to ride a bicycle. It's not something we're conscious of. We jump back on, there we go. It does not require focal conscious attention to be created, those implicit memories. And when the implicit memory emerges, you do not have the sensation that something's being recalled from the past. And we'll talk about this in just a second. It does not require participation of the part of the brain called the hippocampus. Direct attention requires the hippocampus. Okay, so what? Well, the idea that implicit memory, if we have trauma, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and we're talking childhood experiences, we're talking kids 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12 years old, they're going to have trauma-induced memory that they have no clue about, none. They're not aware of it. It's like post-traumatic stress syndrome. These things happen without people being consciously aware of it. It bypasses the hippocampus. The hippocampus is necessary for us to create explicit memories, including our autobiographical memories. So this is related to the brain function, the brain health. The good thing about our brains is that even with epigenetics, we know, okay, nothing is in concrete, the brain is plastic. Gosh, we can actually change the brain. We can actually understand implicit memory, We can actually do therapy. We can actually do nutritional therapy. We can actually do pharmaceutical, begins to change the brain and can undo some of the damage that's been done. Next slide, please. Yeah, unexamined implicit memories can shape our beliefs and our expectations. And I love the quote by Dr. Siegel, the way we make sense of our lives and free ourselves from the prisons of our past is by actually taking on the understanding of implicit memories, beginning to be direct in our thoughts about things, and this would really be promoting very much cognitive type therapies of all different types, counseling, where you can actually change the structure of the brain. It's so plastic by, not, I wouldn't say simple, but without the use of pharmaceuticals necessarily, or any kind of nutritional, just pure counseling and helping people learn how to use their brains. And when you combine that with the possibility of nutritional therapy and or pharmaceuticals, then you're starting to get some really robust possibility of going back to that network I'm talking about to help people deal with their situation. Next slide, please. And then we go from implicit to explicit memory, and that's integration at work. And integration is huge because explicit memory is a couple of types. One's factual. You know, today is October 6th and ACE is presenting. That's a fact. And then there's episodic. As life unfolds, we accumulate episodic memories, which allow us to develop our autobiographical memories, and we can reconstruct or construct a coherent narrative of our life. And guess what? This requires the hippocampus for explicit memory encoding. Again, trauma. Trauma can impact the hippocampus, shut it off, it doesn't work, things go into the implicit memories, they can be very destructive, traumatic experience then impairs integration. And so it's so important for us to understand the difference between explicit memory and implicit memory, especially how trauma or neurochemical imbalances or our nutritional imbalances can actually impact our thinking in terms of implicit memories as opposed to a cohesive, coherent, explicit life autobiographical sequences. Next slide, please. Dan Siegel wrote a book called Mindsight. It's absolutely fascinating. It's really a wonderful book. He talks about all these different types of integration of the brain, and he talks about how these are all related to different parts of the brain. I don't expect you necessarily to read it, but it's fascinating. The one that is the most significant to brain plasticity for this purpose of this conversation is the integration of consciousness. We just talked about the hippocampus has to be activated, and it is done so through direct intentional thought. It's amazing to think that we can actually begin to change the neural circuits of our brain by intentionally thinking about certain things. The integration of consciousness. As a man thinks or as a woman thinks, so are they. It's powerful. And so these 8 domains of integration just say, you know, ladies and gentlemen, the brain's complex. It needs to be working wholly, fully, functionally. And if anything is off, these things are not necessarily going to be able to happen. And when they do, wow, health can occur. It's pretty cool. Next slide. And then biochemical individuality. I've read a book by Roger Williams who wrote it in the 1940s. And I'm astonished about how, even though nutrition is talked about, it's really not talked about in great depth unless you want to go out and get self-help books on your own. But nutrition is absolutely critical and huge because, you know, all of our neurotransmitters are created from things that we eat, breathe, and drink. So if we don't feed our brain ultimately with the necessary ingredients for good neurotransmitters, we're not going to get them. It's interesting also that he talks about, he doesn't talk, but Dr. Walsh does, about the same 2 parents, 40 million different genetic combinations are possible. And so we shouldn't be surprised, although we sometimes think it like, these 2 siblings are so different, it's amazing. How could they be so different, same parents? Well, because 40 million possible genetic combinations exist. Well, what does that say? Is that we all have individual biochemical components. And since in the last, say, 20, 30 years, it's commonly accepted that most mental disorders involved imbalanced or altered functions of critically important brain chemicals. And one of the ways to help our brains have those right balances is to understand what nutritional deficits we might have. Next slide, please. Biochemical therapy, a natural method of correcting imbalances in neurotransmitter activity. Now, I don't know if doing biochemical and nutritional individuality for my daughter would have made a difference in her life, but I do have to tell you, I never even heard of it. Oh, I heard of good diet. I understood that, and she was very active. She was an athlete, so I understood that. But as far as neurotransmitter imbalances or activity, I had no clue whatsoever. I would have loved to have had a chance to go back and to interact with physicians and naturopaths and psychiatrists and counselors who did want to incorporate this component. It may have made the difference. I know in some lives of some people I've talked to, I know them very well, it did make a difference in their life. And they were as bad in terms of being depressed and suicidal as my daughter was. And their lives were turned around. Our daughter wasn't. And the difference is we didn't try looking at biochemical therapy. So, there's a cross-reference on these things. You may have heard of a book by Dr. Furman called Eat to Live. Fascinating book, outstanding about how we work, why we are eating what we're eating, what we should be eating. And it just so happens to fit in, not intentionally at all, because he didn't write it with those other people in mind, but it fits perfectly with what the studies I've been doing on neurochemistry, biochemistry. It fits. It makes a lot of sense. So that's just another book for you to reference. Next slide, please. And again, I've said this before, so I won't really go into it in great depth, but we don't receive a lifetime supply of brain chemicals at birth. The brain is a chemical factory that continuously produces serotonin, dopamine, and other neurotransmitters throughout our lifetime. And so the primary raw materials come from amino acids, vitamins, minerals, and other natural biochemicals that we obtain from food. And where do we get that? Well, we eat, drink, and breathe. So it's really pretty worth looking at, in my opinion, our individual biochemistry, seeing where there might be natural deficits, and recognizing that what we get in our production is from what we eat, breathe, and drink. Next slide. And this is true. When I went through that training that I got from the two doctors from Bastyr, I just thought, I was astonished. I said, holy cow, I could have said this, considering the complexity of brain chemistry and the multiplicity of gene processes that could go wrong, it's surprising that more humans do not have serious mental problems. And the other thing on the very bottom there, it says, a severe chemical imbalance cannot be loved away, and treatment must be focused on correcting brain chemistry. So to my dear friend who said to their son, just buck up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's all, it's in your mind. You're a wimp. No, he couldn't do what he couldn't do. And not only that, but a person's biochemical tendencies persist throughout life, which suggests that they are genetic or epigenetic in origin. I hope you begin to see some of the links to these things. I'm not an expert in any of these areas, but I'm beginning to see how I want to tie those who are in, if possible, with the help of a person that I'm trying to assist. Next slide. Just one last slide on the methylation, the DNA methylation. That's a process where either the genes express themselves or do not express themselves, depending upon the methylation activity around the histones. And the histone modification are the little tails that the histones have on them, are they accessible or not? And those are impacted, believe it or not, by things you eat, drink, and breathe in terms of nutrition, and also, of course, by pharmaceuticals. but it's real. It's very real. If you look up at epigenetics, if you Google epigenetics, you will get a statement about DNA methylation. Next slide, please. Well, we're coming toward the end of this particular topic, and it's the sunset there. It's a beautiful road, but you know, the road goes on. We're not done. We're just touching the surface with what's going on with mental health. But I sure hope that you got a little bit of the idea of how complex mental health is and how suicide is and how stigma is disintegrating towards those efforts of getting somebody integrated, whole, resilient, helpful. And so, you know, it's like the road is long and the sunset is there, but it's a beautiful sunset. There is promise. And I wanted to show you a couple of other slides to say that, yeah, life does go on, and the reason we do this. So next slide, please. I still have 2 beautiful daughters. There they are. I had 3, I still have 2. And I love them. Their lives are full. And yes, their sister's suicide definitely had a traumatic impact on them, but they're still working through. But you know, the thing is, when people say, Ace, so sorry that you lost your daughter, and I go, yeah, me too, and thank you so very much. But you know, I'm not going to allow the death of my daughter to rob me of the joy of my life, nor am I going to allow it to rob me of the joy of my life with these 2 beautiful girls or the people I work with. Life does go on, and if anything, I can take the death of my daughter and use it as a force to help other people experience life. My daughter would say, Daddy, keep it up, do that. Next slide, please. That was my youngest daughter, who just graduated in May from Georgetown University with her master's degree in conflict resolution. So cool. Next slide. And we have the Charlie Brown Christmas tree in a house which has a roof about 20 feet high, and it got this little skinny tree out there, and they climbed up on this orchard-sized tree to decorate. Life goes on, folks. It's wonderful. Even though we lost somebody, it's like, no, life goes on. Let's focus on moving life forward. Next slide. There they are. Weeby little pumpkins. Perfect time of year for that. And I just wanted to let you know that, yeah, you know, the reason we do this is not to necessarily grieve extensively the loss of somebody that we lost, but to use the loss to promote life in those who we get to impact with and interact with. Next slide. So what we talked about was complexity. I hope you got that. I hope that I wasn't so complex that you lost the idea of complexity. We talked about integration. The mind is integrated, episodic, you know, the types of implicit memories, explicit memories, how the brain is functioning with neurochemicals and natural biochemicals and nutrition. We looked at stigma and said, you know, of all the things in there, stigma is disintegrating. It's a terrible thing. If anything, with this complexity and understanding how complex things are, I would hope that you would not have any stigma left in you toward yourself at all if you experienced any kind of vulnerability. It's like, get rid of it. It's a lie. And then, of course, we talked about resilience, which is trying to overcome the natural deficits or the traumatic episodes in the past. We talked a little bit about epigenetics, and there are some resources that will come up on the next slide. And we talked a little bit about some of the practical strategies out there. My encouragement to you would be, you don't need to be an expert to draw up to somebody, to develop a relationship with them, to have the courage to say, wow, are you thinking about killing yourself? Let me help. Next slide. The transformative process. Hopefully you held on to some things that you knew before you had this our sharing together. Hopefully you let go of some things, including the thought that maybe suicide is a non-complex issue. It's a simple issue, like depression is an all-encompassing term. No, it isn't. There are at least 5 different major categories of chemical depression. And so maybe you can take on some of this knowledge and maybe move on in your own life or with somebody you love. And I would say the key is relationships, both within your network of family and friends and loved ones in church, but also professionals. You can do it. You can be the catalyst to bring people together. It's not like they don't want to, it's just that they're so darn busy, it's hard to do. So you get to be that person. Next slide. These are some slides of books that I recommend. And again, if you wanted to email me, text me, call me, whatever else, there are a lot more resources. I'd be more than happy to talk with you. And my last slide. Thank you so much for letting me share. Just another one of you, just a common ordinary individual who gets to share his story, and maybe through it, you get to touch other people for life. And my last slide gives you my contact information if you would like it. Thank you so much for being a part of this webinar.